So we're living in an era of grand themes whose grandiosity at times seems overwhelming. Scarcity, sustainability, planetary boundaries, the Anthropocene, overpopulation, these have come to brand the environmental moment. Now, common to them all, I would argue, is the sense that space is shrinking for humanity. Resource races are accelerating, and time itself is running out. The very real urgency of addressing climate change is translated as planetary emergency, an apocalypse that threatens to doom us all. According to a 2014 poll by the Public Religion Research Institute, an astonishing 49% of Americans now believe that natural disasters are a sign of the end times. Now, I'm writing a book on apocalypse in the United States, apocalyptic thinking in the US, so I really have it on my brain. But I want to say I'm speaking as someone who comes from the US, which, as you know, has a very peculiar orientation to the rest of the world. So the threat of imminent danger begets a search for safety. I come from a country and culture already obsessed with safety across the political spectrum. On the left, the latest didactic variant of identity politics insists on the creation of so-called safe spaces where marginalized groups can come together and be free of personally traumatic microaggressions, stereotypes, and trigger words. Now, to be included in this safe space, one has to abide by a certain set of implicit and explicit rules that often amount to a kind of self and collective policing. Now, the problem is not so much that people need places where they can feel comfortable and free of hostility. Of course they do, especially people, marginalized people doing political work. But the problem is that spaces where there are differences of opinion and political conflicts, the classroom, for example, are then considered unsafe, and they too must be surveilled and policed. This current emphasis on personal trauma and safety results in no small measure from what sociologist Jackie Orr calls the militarization of inner space, the psychological organization of civil society for the production of violence that occurred after 9/11 in the United States. Encouraged by the mass media to feel psychologically traumatized by the terrorist attacks, rather than understand them in terms of US foreign policy in the Middle East, many Americans came to substitute the trope of trauma for the kind of historical analysis necessary to understand and challenge the power of the national security state. I may be stretching the comparison too far here, but to notions such as planetary boundaries, safe operating space, play into similar subliminal desires for safety, this time from the environmental traumas that are coming to get us, the killer storms, melting glaciers, desperate migrants cut loose by climate change. Last week in Alaska, President Obama put on a theater of the absurd performance, where he trumpeted his concern for indigenous peoples, called for stronger climate policies while endorsing Royal Dutch Shell's drilling in the Arctic. And he even appeared on a reality TV show called Running Wild with Bear Grylls. Bear, by the way, eats all kinds of different kind of meat, from the wild. Topping it off, he tapped into the apocalyptic undercurrent in a speech before an international climate conference. He not only forecast that unchecked climate change would bring about more natural disasters, fair enough, but more scarcity and conflict. Desperate refugees seeking the sanctuaries of nations not their own, he warned. Political disruptions that could trigger multiple conflicts around the globe. Secretary of State John Kerry went even further, quote, "And as we as leaders of countries will begin to witness what we call climate refugees moving. You think migration is a challenge to Europe today because of extremism. Wait until you see what happens when there's an absence of water, an absence of food, or one tribe fighting against another for mere survival. Kerry's really onto tribes. He's used that a couple of months ago as well. He likened the challenge of the uncertainty about the future we face right now with climate change to World War II, when seemingly all of Europe was overrun with evil and civilization itself seemed to be at peril. Meanwhile, the real climate-related conflict of the moment, the competition for control over the Arctic's waterways and rich resources, was downplayed in their remarks. Crucial to the militarization of inner space is the militarization of the environmental imagination. I would be indulging in too much conspiracy thinking, which I do like to do, but I'm trying not to. If I said it was an intentional military psychological operation, a PSYOP, for short. But there is an intentionality here. Turning climate change into a national security threat yields political and economic benefits for multiple interests. The Pentagon, of course, but also many mainstream environmentalists in the United States who say it's the only way to get attention to climate change at the highest levels of government. Or foreign policy think tanks chomping at the bit for juicy new research contracts and the media spotlight. Never underestimate the power of these folks. Whether intentional or not, the insidious ideological work that occurs in the process reinforces the trauma trope and sets the clock to apocalyptic time when there is no time to carefully follow the money and influence trails that reveal what is really going on. Safety becomes the preoccupation, protection the mandate, and who's there to protect us, of course, but you guessed it, the military. It's ironic, of course. In the militarized environmental imagination, the death and destruction caused by war are projected instead onto nature and humanity writ large. As for humanity, it's the population explosion. It's poor, over-fertile women of color who are responsible for the planet's woes, the source of the demographic pressures that threaten to destroy us along with climate change. Indeed, the word overpopulation, which passed out of favor for a little while, is back in vogue, used in a recent White House report on the national security dimensions of climate change. Militarization further works its magic when people come to accept that climate change and resource scarcities are primary causes of violent conflict and war. Delivering a graduation address to the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in May, President Obama linked climate change to the rise of Boko Haram in Nigeria and the civil war in Syria. Syria, in fact, has taken over from Darfur as the new climate war story, with severe drought as the match that ignited the conflagration. While the media hypes up the connection, more staid bureaucrats speak of climate change as a so-called threat multiplier, letting themselves off the evidence hook by leaving out any precise calculations. Threat multiplier by a factor of 2, a factor of 100, it doesn't matter. What matters is that term finds its way into the militarized environmental imagination in the space reserved for apocalyptic arithmetic. And I've just watched this threat multiplier language be used over and over again in the media, in national security documents, and it has a kind of life of its own. Now, if the underlying cause of the civil war in Syria is climate change, does that make the millions of people the violence has displaced into so-called climate refugees? Commentators are beginning to suggest as much, and Obama and Kerry's recent remarks about desperate refugees and a Europe overrun with evil are softening us up for the connection. The naturalization of forced migration adds exodus to apocalypse in the militarized environmental imagination, all the easier to do since the embattled landscapes of the Middle East visually call to mind the geographies and migrations of biblical times. This naturalization dehumanizes and depoliticizes, preparing the ground for the portrayal of those forced to move as security threats. They are the ones who have truly suffered trauma and need safe spaces, but we're told we need safety from them. The shrinking safe spaces of Schengen must be ringed with ever more barbed wire, surveillance cameras, fingerprinting machines, and men with guns. And of course, the latest episodes in Hungary with the trains, are reminiscent of the Holocaust. Never mind that it's the neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan that have taken in the vast majority of Syrian refugees who have fled the country, over 3 million now. Europe has taken in 300,000 or so, set to take in more, we hope. The U.S., in its infinite generosity, has so far accepted 1,000. Now, The World at War was the title of UNHCR's 2014 report on the growing numbers of forcibly displaced people, an estimated 60 million by the end of that year. They're not only fleeing Syria, of course, but other past and present conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, South Sudan, Myanmar, the list goes on. Is it climate change and resource scarcities forcing those migrations? Or in the words of UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, more and more impunity for those starting conflicts, and quote, the utter inability of the international community to work together to stop wars and build and preserve peace. Now, at this conference, I hope we can come together to resist the militarization of inner space and of the environmental imagination. In fact, to demilitarize those spaces, and to question the grand themes, scarcity, sustainability, planetary boundaries, the Anthropocene, overpopulation, and others like them, that encourage a sense of boundedness, of borders, of stasis, of limits. Sometimes I think that in reacting against notions of infinite growth and capitalist cornucopia, we unnecessarily fetter our capacity to imagine a better future, including the possibility of progressive technological and institutional change. It's not growth per se, which is the problem, but what kinds of growth. We also need to be aware of the borders and boundaries erected between us. The academy itself these days is a site of shrinking spaces and resource races, with competition enshrined as a holy grail of budget allocation, especially in the UK. This competition pits disciplines, departments, and universities against each other and is hardly conducive to the kind of collegial and innovative border crossings that create new avenues of thought, including new vocabularies to describe current economic, political, and environmental realities. In a sense, we're in a period where we're at a loss for words. I mean, we have lots of words, but we're at a loss for words that really grab people. The old ones, like neoliberalism, don't quite cut it. It describes certain, of course, processes, but we need new words too. And if we don't come up with the right new terms, the right will most certainly fill the verbal vacuum. It's already attempting to do so. The pressures and expectations associated with academic competition hem scholars into a narrow universe. Who has time to stray outside, to participate in political activism, to write for the popular press when those things are counted against you? And how welcome are the halls of academe to activists? One mourns the decline of the tradition of the public intellectual. If we are to liberate our imaginations, come up with new words, ideas, and strategies, and put them into practice, then it behooves us not to retreat to safe spaces, but to open and widen spaces for political creativity. Transgress, not egress, and demilitarize the imagination. So this conference is an important opportunity to do precisely that. And I know when I came here 10 years ago, it was such a relief to be in a group of people who were doing just that. I'm honored to be here again, and I look forward to 3 amazing days of putting our heads and hearts together. Thank you very much.